Hello everybody and welcome to passedpawns. This video is going to be covering how you can get better at tactics and how to improve them in just 4 simple steps. So this video is going to be broken up into 4 parts, which you can see right here. They're also going to be timestamped, so you can skip to each one if you need to, but I recommend going through the entire video as each step is going to be building on the previous one and it's going to help you get a better understanding of how you can improve your tactics. So let's get started with step number 1, which is material count. Material count is arguably the most important part of any tactic because if you are down a queen and you find a tactic that wins you a knight, you're still going to be losing, and even though you did find a tactic that wins you a piece, it's not going to be really worth it and you're still going to be down material and probably going to lose the game. So the number one thing I want you to do, whether you're playing puzzles or you're in an actual game, is to keep track of the material count because that is the most important part of any chess tactic. In this particular case, we can notice that we're down a rook for a pawn, which is obviously not beneficial for us. And so trying to win this knight with moves like bishop d6 isn't necessarily going to be worth it. The one thing that we can do in this position is either try to win a rook, a queen, checkmate, or find a draw. And in this particular case, one of these 4 options is definitely possible. So I want you to pause this video right here, try to figure out the solution, and then I'm going to explain my thought process and how you could figure out the way to get through this tactic. Now we're going to talk about the solution. So in this case, since we're down a lot of material, we're going for something really forcing. We can notice that this rook is really dangerous, and if we play something like bishop d6, we're going to get hit with something like rook cd1, and we're not going to end up winning anything. So we can find ideas like sacrifices. For example, we can see that rook takes e2 over here is quite powerful because after rook takes e2, queen takes e2, we have this queen f4 move. And the reason that queen f4 is actually a very good move is because it's quite forcing, and we can notice that wherever this king goes, it's not very good. For example, we can take this rook over here, and now the material balance has pretty much been restored. Yes, we are down exchange for a rook, a bishop for a rook. However, the way these pieces are positioned for white is quite terrible. I mean, this rook is literally locked in by its own king. And so here we can just simply take this b2 pawn, and the engine already likes black a lot more. It's minus 1.5. Then we can give some more checks, maybe use this bishop and activate it and try to win some more pieces. Likewise, if the king goes over to e1, it's even worse because we can take this rook, and now the queen cannot actually step in and block this check, and in fact this king has to go to f2, in which case we win the next rook, and suddenly we're just up 2 pawns and we're a lot better. So that is why this position is very interesting, because queen f4 check forces this queen to go to f3, and now we can get a series of moves that go by repetition. We can go back to d2, and continue checking. Now, if obviously the queen blocks on e2, we can just get a series of repetitions, in which case we get a draw, which is one of the things that we would want to get in a position we're down 4 points of material. However, if after queen d2, the king escapes to g3, we can continue checking here, queen g5. If the king goes to h3, we can hit him with queen h6. We do not want to go to bishop f5 here, which looks like a very appealing move, but actually g4 stops it, because even though we can go to queen h5 and it looks really cool, since this pawn cannot take, since it's pinned to the king can just escape to g2, and this is actually not very good at all for black, because it just gives white another escape square, and even though we do end up winning this pawn and it looks really cool, we don't actually get anything out of it. So queen h6 is the better move. We want to play queen h6, not queen h5, to avoid any potential trades, which is another very important thing in tactics. Is whenever you're down material, you generally don't want to trade any pieces, because that removes any ability for you to find attacking chances and tactics. Since if you trade down to a very simple endgame where your opponent is simply up material, you're just going to be losing, and there's not going to be any tactical possibilities for you to find. That being said, after queen h6, your opponent can go back to g5, and then you can continue checking, and this is going to end up a stalemate. If your opponent tries to stop you by dropping the queen in here, you can actually just go back to e6 here, e3, and you're going to continue with the same amount of checks, and simply it's going to be a stalemate. So the answer to this puzzle and the solution is to find a draw. That is the best possible variation, if your opponent plays well, that is, because technically your opponent could go to the back rank, in which case you would simply win one of the rooks. Now, the whole point of this puzzle was to illustrate the importance of material count, because if, let's say, this rook did not exist, this game would be completely different, and then we could try and find a way to win this knight. However, in this particular case, we notice and we switch our mindset from trying to win a knight over to trying to find a draw or a checkmate. And the way we can find this draw is simply by the fact that we have a series of forced moves, because queen f4 is a very forced move. In fact, it only allows for one possible move, which is queen f3. And from there, we can just find a series of repetitive checks that allow us to secure the half point and move on to our next game. Now, next up, I want to talk about tactical motifs. So tactical motifs come in all shapes and sizes and can basically mean anything. Once you've counted the material, though, you can really narrow down what sort of tactical motifs you're looking for. What do I mean by that? Well, in this position, we're down an exchange, bishop for a rook, and so we're down 2 points of material. We do notice that we can take this rook, so if we simply just calculate that in our head and we take this rook, and then black takes our knight, we can notice that this position is pretty bad for us. This is still very good for black, and the reason being is this d4 pawn is under attack. We have to go bishop f2. And after something like bishop f2, queen f7, we can slide the queen over to e2. There's not really much we can do here. But the point is, after queen f5 and let's say we try for b6, try to promote the pawn, we're going to get hit with rook e4, and this position sucks. Our king is very, very weak, and we're simply going to end up losing this bishop, because if we were to go to queen c2, which is the only other square that keeps this bishop alive, we could simply get hit with something like rook e1 check, bishop takes, and queen takes c2, because it's a discover check on the queen, and we would just be completely losing here. So obviously we want to avoid that. We notice that if we simply take this rook with our bishop, we're going to end up a lot worse, because black's rook is going to be incredibly strong, and there's a very easy open file that black can access. So now we look at what other possibilities we have. What are some tactical motifs? Obviously, these rooks are hanging, so obviously we're probably going to capitalize off of that. However, we also notice that black's pawns aren't exactly in the best positions. For example, this h6 pawn is definitely overextended, and black's king is quite vulnerable. So here we kind of get the ideas of sacrifices. For example, knight f6, which looks like a fork. Of course, black is able to take this pawn, but then we can take this rook. You can also see the idea of knight takes h6, which might look like a better sacrifice since we're winning a pawn right away. However, it's not as good because simply rook takes, and afterwards we traded a rook for 2 pieces. Now we're still down material, and we don't have any tactics. So let's quickly look over knight f6. The whole point is that after g takes f6, we can take this rook, and after something like rook g4 once again, we no longer have to go to f2 because we can simply take this f6 pawn. Point being is that now black cannot take this d4 pawn, given that we can go queen g6 and we're simply completely winning. Like, no matter what black does here, and this is just losing. Queen takes h6, the king runs away, we continue checking, and this is checkmate. So obviously black cannot do that. The whole thing that changed from the previous position is that instead of just taking this rook and then allowing the black rook to recapture our knight, we've made it so that we win an extra pawn, and also there's no longer a possibility for this queen to go to f7 because, well, this doesn't actually attack anything. The bishop is here, and we're doing quite well. This also mitigates the idea of rook takes d4 because we don't have to play bishop f2, and we can just play bishop f6. And like I mentioned earlier, rook takes d4 allows for queen g6 check, and it's going to be very, very strong. And so really the only thing that changed from the previous position over here is that instead of allowing black to recapture this knight on g4, we've made it so that this pawn is now misplaced on f6. This king is a lot more open because now there's this g6 check. And we've made it so that after something like rook g4, d4 is no longer a threat because, like I said, bishop takes f6. This prevents queen f7 ideas. And also, rook takes d4 runs into queen g6 check like we just talked about. So this is a much, much better variation of what we had just looked at. So this is already a big improvement. The way we were able to find that is once again through a tactical motif of this overexposed king with this h6 pawn and the missing f pawns, meaning that this king is just as weak as our king on h1. And now, what can black really do? Well, black can try, for example, knight e3, let's say. Knight e3 isn't a very good try because simply queen c1. Now we're attacking this knight, and we're attacking this h6 pawn. The best move for black here is actually just to go back and be completely worse. So a better try than knight e3 would probably be queen h7. In which case we can simply trade queens. You can take this pawn with check. You can play bishop e7. Point being is that after rook takes d4, you're going to play bishop c5. And wherever this rook goes, like say rook d1, rook checks, whatever. Let's just say, I don't even know here. Rook e2, trying to attack this pawn. Or maybe rook takes a2. You could just play b5, and now this knight has to sacrifice itself because otherwise you're going to promote this pawn. So once again, a tactical motif we can find here is that we have a passed pawn that we can push, and given that we've placed our bishop on c5, we can now exploit this passed pawn and win material. And so this position looks a lot better than the original. We're up a bishop. We're definitely going to promote here with this b pawn because we can just play bishop c5 once again. And if we need to, we can sacrifice our bishop for this a pawn that's going to promote soon. We're going to be completely fine. This was once again a really good puzzle to illustrate some tactical motifs while also building on top of the idea of counting material. Since we weren't down that much material, we could afford to just win the exchange back and then capitalize on the fact that we had these passed pawns. However, if we were down, for example, this queen, we would have to look for some sort of checkmate, and simply this tactic would not be possible. Now, the reason you can find this knight f6 sacrifice is, well, for one, this knight is basically trapped, and two is we figured out that bishop takes h4 isn't really possible. However, we did figure out that knight f6 still wins us this rook. It just is a better alternative because you end up also winning an extra pawn, and this is a forced move. Like, black has to take with the pawn here because otherwise you simply win the queen, since it's a fork of king and queen. So if the king was to move, you would just win the queen. Obviously meaning that this pawn capture is forced, and from there you would just get a much better position than you would had you just traded pieces originally. Let's move on to our third category, which is prophylactic moves. These are some of the most important patterns in any sort of tactic. In this position, it's white to move. Make sure you pause this video, try to figure out what the tactic is, and now I'm going to try and explain to you guys what's happening here. So I think we all see that we want to play either queen e5 or queen f6. Let's just say queen e5. Point being is that this is basically a forced mate. You know, white or black cannot stop this because if black goes queen f7, we simply have queen h8, and this is a very, very nice victory. However, what we do notice is that after queen e5, there is a very, very annoying move that black can play, which is bishop d4. And bishop d4 forces a trade here, and with this queen check, we simply have to trade everything off. We lose all tactical possibilities. And we're actually a lot worse here because our knight and rook are very, very passive, whilst black's rook and bishop are extremely strong. We're going to lose this pawn, and then we're just going to be down 2 pawns, and black's going to be a lot better. So what the concept of prophylaxis or prophylactic moves are is that you play a move in order to prevent an idea. So instead of going for a direct tactic, you simply play a very quiet move, but it will prevent any idea, such as bishop d4. So in this position, I want you guys to think for a moment, what sort of move will prevent bishop d4? And that move is knight e2. Knight e2 prevents bishop d4 because it literally surveys that square, and the tactic stays the same. For example, whatever black does here, let's say queen f7, right away we can play queen e5, and we once again have the same idea. Bishop d4 obviously isn't possible here, you just simply lose a bishop, but I'll just say a completely different move like a6 was played. After queen e5, bishop d4 would no longer be possible because now knight takes d4, and queen takes d4 obviously loses all the pieces. So with that in mind, we know that knight e2 is a very good move. Now, if something like queen f7 was played and we could play queen e5, we could get, you know, the king to run away since we wasted a tempo on knight e2. But this doesn't stop us from winning material. For example, we can play knight f4 here, and we notice that bishop d4 isn't possible just because, well, there's no longer a queen here. So bishop d4 would lose an exchange, and this would be very, very much beneficial for white. Let's say black tries to escape with something like rook e8. We have a very, very simple tactic here with knight takes e6, rook takes e6, queen h8. You know, queen g8 could try and block. However, then you run into bishop a3. And after the king slides down, you simply have rook takes h7, in which case black will lose the queen and end up getting checkmated in the very next move. If the queen doesn't block, and after queen h8, let's say king e7, we still have this rook h7 idea where we simply win the queen, and we're a lot better. So prophylactic moves do waste the tempo technically, but we still get a very, very pleasant position where we're up a queen for a rook. And so obviously this is something that we want to go for. Now, prophylactic moves are usually very difficult to find because sometimes we can get tunnel visioned on this one tactic that we see and we just want to play it anyway. However, if you see a tactic that can get refuted by a specific move, you will then try to look for combinations, even if they're not the most forcing or if they're just quiet moves that prevent the refutation from actually happening. So in this case, knight e2 is the example of this refutation. It simply stops bishop d4 and you get an extremely good position. Now guys, we've just covered counting the material, looking for tactical motifs, and finding prophylactic moves. Now we can tie all of these things into doing puzzles. Now, this is probably the most simple point because puzzles are widely accessible. You can do them on chess.com, on Lichess, or on basically any other site. But a lot of people do them wrong. So the whole point is, whenever you're doing a puzzle, a lot of people just try to blitz through them, do them in like 10 seconds, and this is not really going to help boost your tactical abilities. In fact, you're probably going to end up either being stagnant with your rating or you're going to end up losing rating. If you want to hit something like 3,000 on puzzles, you're going to have to be very diligent in the way you're thinking, and you're going to want to apply all of these things that I just talked about into your tactics training. So whenever you're doing a puzzle, I want every one of you to count the material, to then look at the simple tactical motifs. For example, tactical motifs, I know we only covered just one, like the overexposed pawns and the weak king. However, tactical motifs can include things like unprotected pieces. For example, if there wasn't a pawn here, this piece would be a unprotected and hanging piece, which you could then attack. Other tactical motifs could be pins, skewers, deflection, which we're going to talk about in this puzzle, and so on. So you want to approach tactics and puzzles in the same way that you would approach playing a classical game. You want to take your time. You want to go over each and every possible option. You're not going for time here. You're going for precision and accuracy, because after doing a lot of puzzles where you're really focused on getting the right answer instead of going for speed, your tactical vision is going to improve marginally, and you're going to become a much better tactician. Now, this is the last puzzle I want to show, which really ties all three concepts that we talked about together very well. This is a puzzle that I had from a book called Chess Tests by Mark Dvoretsky. It's a very nice book. And here there are two possible solutions. I want you to pause the video and try to figure this one out. Count the material, look at some tactical motifs, and find some prophylactic moves. And finally, I'm going to talk about how I would solve this puzzle. So first things first, we can notice that this h6 pawn is quite strong and grabs the square on g7, and it prevents the king from really going here. We can also notice that we have these two rooks that really restrict the king's movement, making this king quite weak. So that's one thing that we've identified, is that this king is quite weak. We've also identified that this e6 square is also quite weak because no other pawns protect it, and yet we have two minor pieces attacking it, which would be very strong. So both this e6 square is weak, and so is the king. However, obviously this e6 square is quite well protected right now, so a good thing that we could do is try to deflect pieces away from this e6 square and then try to capitalize on it. Now, there are two possible solutions to this puzzle. However, I'm going to go over both of them. One might be more obvious than the other, and so I'm going to start with that one. First, we can look at deflection. Deflection means that you're taking a piece away from its square in order for it to stop protecting what it once used to protect. What I mean by that is playing the move bishop g5 is a bishop sacrifice, yes, but it also takes this queen away from once protecting this e6 square. And what it also does is it stops this queen from protecting this f8 and f7 squares, meaning that we can have a much easier way to infiltrate. From here, we're going to sacrifice another piece by playing bishop e6 check after bishop takes. And by the way, the rook cannot take. One second. The rook cannot take here because then rook f8 is checkmate. So bishop has to take. And then we can sacrifice yet another piece. This is a very beautiful combination of three-piece sacrifices, where we're going to sacrifice our rook here. And after this king takes, we can notice now that finally we've deflected all of the pieces away from e6. And now knight takes e6 check comes in and simply wins the queen. And so you end up in a very pleasant position where you have a queen for a rook and knight. And you are just significantly better here because, well, first of all, you have a material advantage, but also you have a very easy way of playing with these three pawns that you can end up pushing and just giving checks and infiltrating into your opponent's position. However, the much better alternative that you can play, and even though it's very difficult to reject a beautiful combination like this, is a very quiet move such as knight f3. And this is a prophylactic move. The whole point of knight f3 is that after knight f3, the idea of bishop g5 opens up. Meaning that after knight f3 and let's say, I don't know, knight f7, bishop g5 is extremely strong and you're going to end up winning material. However, obviously most people would just trade knights here, which is what I'm going to cover. After rook takes f7, let's say bishop c6, your opponent doesn't really have that many moves. You can play queen c3. Whole point of queen c3 is that we're aiming at this g7 square, meaning that we want to play bishop g5 and just force this queen to trade and then either deliver checkmate, or if the queen doesn't trade, we can just start a huge attack with this bishop e6 move and probably still find a way to mate our opponent. e5 stops this idea, but then we still hit our opponent with bishop g5. If the queen takes, we have bishop e6 check. This king slides out of the way, and then rook sacrifice into checkmate. Highlighting, once again, the importance of this h6 pawn and the weakness of the king, we're able to sacrifice a bunch of pieces, deflect the queen, and still find a way to win this game just because of how weak the opponent's king was. And by the way, if the queen does not take this bishop, it can go to c7, and then you can play bishop e6, and after rook takes e6, you still have the exact same checkmate. And so this position works out either way. Now guys, this covers both solutions for this puzzle as well as all of the puzzles that I wanted to show you guys in this particular video. Just to recap, we've covered 4 topics. We've covered the material count and the material imbalances, how that can dictate what sort of tactics you could be looking for. We've covered tactical motifs, so things like weaken overexposed kings. Then we talked about prophylactic moves. However, they are quite difficult to find, and that's why I presented a way for you guys to kind of search for them. Once you find a refutation to your tactic, you can always look for a prophylactic move, and it's probably going to be one of the best moves in your position. And lastly, we tie it all in with proper tactics training. Once again, if you guys are doing puzzles, take as much time as you need rather than going for speed. You want to focus on accuracy, and then you're going to become a much better tactician. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Helps my channel out a ton, and I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye.